She opened that hotel room door carrying his favorite dinner in her hands, and standing at the mirror, in his shirt, was another woman. The woman turned around, looked her straight in the eye, and smiled. Not with shame, not with guilt, with absolute confidence. Because she knew something Claire did not yet know. Something that would take 1 full year, 3 betrayals, 2 near destructions of everything Claire had built, and 1 woman in a red dress to finally bring into the light. This is not a story about a cheating husband. This is a story about a plan. A coordinated, calculated, long-running plan, and the one person they forgot to account for. Stay with me. Because the moment Claire walks into that ballroom, everything changes. And the ending? Nobody in that room saw it coming. Meaning and value. This story is a reminder that dignity is not weakness, patience is not passivity, and the person who keeps their records, keeps their word, and keeps going, outlasts every strategy built against them. If you are in a season where it feels like everything is being taken from you, remember Claire Whitfield. She did not fight loudly, she documented, she worked, she waited, and she walked into that room and reminded everyone what she was worth, without saying a single word more than necessary. Call to action. If this story stayed with you, if even one moment felt familiar or gave you something you needed today, do one small thing before you leave. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that stories like this one matter to you. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment hit hardest. Was it the parking garage, the red dress, the final reveal? We read every single one. Share this with someone who is going through something difficult right now. You do not have to explain why you are sending it. They will understand when they hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe. Because every story on this channel is built the same way this one was, carefully, honestly, and with full respect for the person at the center of it. We will see you in the next one. Stay standing.
There is a particular kind of quiet that exists in a room where someone is doing work they genuinely love. Not silence exactly. More like the absence of performance. The absence of trying. Claire Whitfield had built her entire life around that quiet. Her studio occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Wentworth Street in Charleston, South Carolina, 3 blocks from the waterfront and approximately 1 lifetime away from the person she used to think she would become. The building was old, the floors were uneven, the windows leaked cold air every January without fail, and the radiator made a sound like someone dragging furniture across a cement floor. Claire had learned to love the radiator. She named it Gerald, after her father. She was 29 years old, and on the morning this story truly begins, she was standing at her work table under a large daylight lamp, her hair pinned back with a paintbrush she had forgotten was there, carefully removing a layer of discolored varnish from a 19th century landscape that a man named Mr. Patterson had given up on entirely. 3 other studios had told Mr. Patterson the piece was too far gone. Claire had looked at it for a long time. Then she said, quietly, that she could see what it used to be. That was enough. Her father, Gerald Whitfield, had been a Navy officer who collected antique paintings the way other men collected baseball cards. With obsession, with tenderness, and with very little regard for how much space they took up. He died when Claire was 19, leaving her his collection, his tools, and a note written on the back of a receipt that said, "These things survived wars, Claire, so will you." She had read that note approximately 400 times. It lived in the top drawer of her work table, folded into a small square. On particularly difficult days, she unfolded it, read it once, folded it again, and went back to work. Her mother, Barbara Whitfield, had retired from 30 years of school librarianship and now lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house with too many plants and not enough furniture. She called every Sunday at 10 in the morning and every Wednesday at 7 in the evening. She had 2 rules she had raised Claire on: do good work and never apologize for who you are. She said these things the way other mothers said, eat your vegetables, often enough that they took root. Claire's professional life was modest and serious. Whitfield Restoration had a reputation among estate lawyers, private collectors, and the Charleston Museum of Art as the studio you called when you cared more about getting it right than getting it fast. She did not advertise. She did not have a website that worked properly. She had a phone number, a business card, and 7 years of results that spoke in a language collectors understood immediately. Her assistant and only employee was a young man named Jake Brennan. Jake was 24, recently graduated from the College of Charleston with a degree in art history, deeply passionate about the conservation of early American portraiture, and constitutionally incapable of making a cup of coffee that a human being would voluntarily drink. Claire had hired him 6 months ago after watching him spend 45 minutes in her studio asking questions that proved he had actually read every paper she had ever published in a regional conservation journal. Nobody had ever read those papers. She offered him the job on the spot. Jake was currently in the back room cataloging a set of damaged frames and listening to a podcast about the Florentine Renaissance at a volume that suggested he believed everyone in the building shared his enthusiasm. Claire did not mind. She had learned to tune it to background music. It was a Tuesday in late October when the bell above the studio door rang. She did not look up immediately. Most people who walked through that door were either collectors who knew to wait or delivery drivers who did not. Either way, she was in the middle of a delicate passage of varnish removal, and the painting took priority. Then the man spoke. "I need this restored perfectly," he said. "Money is not the issue." Claire set down her swab. She turned around. He was standing in the center of the room holding a wrapped canvas under one arm like it was a magazine. He was perhaps 38, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair gone silver at the temples, and a suit that had been cut specifically for his body by someone who charged accordingly. He was the kind of man who filled a room not by being loud, but by expecting to. His shoes, Claire noticed, were flawless. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Money never is." For people who lead with that sentence. He blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. His name was Bradley Harmon. He ran an architecture firm with offices in Charleston and Atlanta. He had acquired the painting at an estate sale 3 months earlier and had, in his words, made the mistake of letting it sit in direct sunlight in his Atlanta office for 6 weeks before realizing what he had. Claire unwrapped the canvas carefully and examined it under the lamp. It was a coastal landscape, oil on board, late 19th century, and it had 3 distinct cracks running through the lower third where the wood panel had shifted with humidity changes. The varnish was yellowed and uneven. The lower right corner had a patch of active flaking. She described all this in precise, unhurried language, while Bradley Harmon stood across the table and watched her work instead of listening to what she was saying. When she finished and quoted him the price, without hesitation, he smiled. "When can you start?" Betty asked. "I already have," she said, and turned back to Mr. Patterson's landscape. He left the painting and walked out. Claire watched him go. Then she went back to work. Jake appeared in the doorway of the back room, with his podcast paused and a look on his face that suggested he had been listening to considerably more than Renaissance history. "That guy," Jake said carefully, "looked at you like you were the most interesting thing he had ever seen in a room." "He looked at the painting," Claire said. "He looked at both," Jake said, and disappeared back into the storage room. He was not wrong. Bradley Harmon returned 2 days later, claiming he had forgotten to ask about preservation framing options. Claire explained the options clearly and professionally. He asked several questions that indicated he had done research between visits, which she found unexpectedly impressive. He left without lingering. He returned 4 days after that with coffee, black for himself, oat milk latte for her, because he had noticed the cup on her desk during the first visit. He set it beside her tools without touching anything else and did not make a production of it. Claire picked it up, took a sip, looked at him over the rim. "That's a very specific coffee order to remember," she said. "I pay attention," he said simply. Donna Pierce, Claire's best friend since the 9th grade, happened to stop by for lunch that afternoon and watched Bradley's departure through the studio window with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting for something interesting to happen in her week. "That man," Donna said, unwrapping a sandwich with great deliberation. "Pressed his jeans to come to see you?" "He was wearing suit pants," Claire said. "He was wearing pressed pants," Donna said. "And there is a difference, and you know it." Donna was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and had, in Claire's estimation, the most precisely calibrated nonsense detector of anyone she had ever met. She was loud and certain, and occasionally wrong, but never about people. When Donna had a feeling about someone, Claire had learned to pay attention. Donna's feeling about Bradley Harmon, delivered over the remains of her turkey sandwich, was this: he's either exactly what he looks like, or he is a project. "And you," she said, pointing a potato chip at Claire, "are not a project person. You are the person who takes broken things and makes them whole. That's different. That matters." Claire thought about that for a long time after Donna left. 3 weeks later, when Bradley asked her to dinner for the fourth time, she said yes. She was not sure why she trusted him. She was not sure it was entirely logical, but there was something in the fact that he had never once asked her to be different from what she already was. He seemed, genuinely and without performance, to find her exactly as she was to be the most interesting version of a person he had encountered in years. Later, she would understand that this was partly true, and partly something else entirely. But that evening, walking into the restaurant he had chosen overlooking the harbor, watching him stand up when she came through the door, in her plain blue dress, with her hair down and no jewelry except her grandmother's small gold earrings, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt seen. The months that followed were the kind of months that feel, in memory, like they existed in better light than ordinary time. Bradley Harmon was, in those early months, a man who seemed to understand that the most interesting thing he could do was be genuinely present. He sat in Claire's studio on Saturday mornings and read while she worked, learning to be quiet in the particular way the space required. He asked questions about her work that showed he had been thinking about her answers from previous conversations. He remembered small things: that she preferred window seats, that she found loud restaurants exhausting, that she felt most herself outdoors near water. He did not try to change her. This was the part she kept coming back to, later when she was trying to understand how she had missed what was underneath it. Their first real disagreement came 4 months into the relationship, when Bradley suggested, gently, that she might enjoy attending a firm dinner with his Atlanta colleagues. She went, in her usual simple dress, and spent the evening feeling like a person reading a book in a language she almost understood. The conversation moved fast and sideways through topics she had no entry points into. She smiled when it seemed appropriate. She ate her dinner carefully and said the right things when addressed. On the drive home, Bradley told her she had done great. She looked out the window and said nothing, because what she was thinking was that doing great at being invisible was not, in her estimation, something worth praising. She told Donna about it the next morning. Donna chewed on this information for a moment. Then she said, "The question is not whether he thinks you did great. The question is whether he knows you were invisible." Claire did not have an answer to that, but she let it go, because the good parts were genuinely good. And because she was 30 years old and she had learned that most worthwhile things required some degree of navigating discomfort. Bradley proposed on a Wednesday evening in March, arriving at the studio just before closing, setting a small velvet box beside a coastal landscape Claire had just finished restoring. The painting was of a sunrise over water, the colors finely true after months of careful work, the kind of painting that made you feel like you were watching something real rather than looking at something old. He stood on the other side of the kitchen table, beside the Bastien side the work table, and said, "You restore beautiful things. I would like you to restore my faith that a good life is still possible." Claire looked at the box, then at him, then at the painting behind him, glowing with its recovered colors in the warm studio light. She said yes. Donna, upon receiving the phone call approximately 12 minutes later, responded with a scream loud enough that the paralegal in the next office came to check if someone was injured. She was not. She was, in fact, making a reservation at Claire's favorite restaurant for the following Saturday and already composing a maid of honor speech that would, she informed Claire, feature at least 2 stories Claire would prefer she did not tell. "Only 2?" Claire said. "I have self-control," Donna said. Selective self-control. The wedding was held in September in Savannah, outdoors, in the garden of an old inn, with Spanish moss in the trees and the late afternoon light falling gold across the grass. It was small, 30 people, exactly the size Claire wanted. Donna stood beside her in a deep blue dress and cried from the second the processional began, periodically denying this to anyone who looked at her directly. Barbara Whitfield sat in the front row in her best dress and held her handbag with both hands the entire ceremony, which was how Claire knew she was trying not to cry. The first year of marriage was genuinely good. That is important to say plainly, because what came after tends to recolor everything before it, and that is not fair to the truth. The first year was good. Bradley was present and kind. They learned each other's rhythms. He cooked on Sundays with varying results that they ate together at the kitchen table, while Claire read him things from whatever book she was in the middle of. He started a small collection of contemporary works for the apartment, asking her opinion on each one and taking her answers seriously. She was, during that year, happy. Then the Atlanta contract arrived. Bradley's firm had been bidding on a large commercial development project for 18 months. When it landed large, a multi-building complex worth more than anything the firm had previously undertaken. The timeline was aggressive. The client meetings were frequent. The office in Atlanta required his presence 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week. Claire understood this. She said she understood this, and she meant it, because she was a woman who knew what it meant to be absorbed by work you cared about. But understanding something is not the same as being unaffected by it. He started coming home quiet in a way that felt managed rather than tired. He started commenting on small things. Her hair before a dinner, the dress she had worn to the last event, the way she went quiet in rooms full of his colleagues. The comments were gentle, at first, the kind of thing you could hear as caring rather than criticism if you were inclined to hear it that way. And Claire was inclined to hear it that way because she loved him. She started trying harder. New dresses, styled hair. She spent evenings memorizing the names and roles and interests of his clients before dinners so she would have something to contribute to conversations. She attended the events and stayed quiet when the talk flew past her, and smiled when it seemed appropriate, and told herself that every marriage had its seasons, and this was a demanding one, and it would pass. What she did not know was that in Atlanta, a different season had already begun. She did not know about the fitness club near his office. She did not know about the woman with the perfect blonde hair who laughed at exactly the right moments and spoke fluent financial vocabulary and could remember the name of every person she met within 60 seconds of meeting them. She did not know that her husband was, 3 days a week in Atlanta, having coffee and then lunch and then longer lunches with a woman named Vanessa Colton. She did not know any of this. She was in her studio in Charleston, carefully restoring a damaged portrait for the estate of a woman she had never met, thinking about whether she should buy a new dress for the Henderson dinner next week. She was, as she would say later to Donna, looking in entirely the wrong direction. The thing about betrayal is that it announces itself in the body before the mind is willing to process it. Claire had been carrying a low, persistent unease for approximately 6 weeks before the Tuesday evening in November when everything became undeniable. She had named it stress. She had named it the season. She had named it her own insecurity and tendency to overthink, which Bradley had mentioned twice in the past month as something she might want to work on. She had not named it correctly. Bradley had been in Atlanta for 4 days. He texted on schedule. He called on Wednesday evening and asked about the studio and mentioned he had a late dinner with clients on Thursday and would be home Friday afternoon. All of this was consistent with recent patterns. On Thursday morning, Claire received a call from a woman at the front desk of Bradley's firm asking to confirm delivery of a document package to his hotel for Friday checkout. She confirmed it. She took down the hotel name out of habit, the way you do when you are half listening to a phone call while doing something else. That evening, she made his favorite dinner, roasted chicken, the recipe his mother had given her at Christmas. She made too much of it, the way you do when you are cooking for 2 people and find yourself in the kitchen at 6 in the evening, with the particular energy of wanting to do something useful. She looked at the extra portions. She thought about how long it had been since she surprised him with anything. She packed the food carefully into a bag, got in her car, and drove to Atlanta. She told herself on the 2-hour drive that she was being romantic, that he would be pleased, that this was exactly the kind of spontaneous thing that marriages needed, especially in demanding seasons. She told herself this with the conviction of someone who is aware, somewhere underneath the telling, that they are not being entirely honest with themselves. She parked in the hotel garage. She rode the elevator to the 8th floor. She walked down the corridor, carrying the bag of food, listening to her own footsteps, thinking about nothing in particular. She knocked. No answer. She used the key card he had given her months ago for exactly this purpose, his words for exactly this purpose, and opened the door. The room was lit warmly. Music was playing from a phone on the nightstand, something low and jazzy. A bottle of wine sat open on the small table with 2 glasses, one of them half empty, and Vanessa Colton was standing at the bathroom mirror in Bradley's white dress shirt, applying lipstick with the focused attention of a woman who had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. The restaurant bag was still in Claire's hand. The 4 seconds of silence that followed were the longest of Claire's life, not because of the noise they contained, because of the absence of any sound at all. No traffic, no music registering, no breath she was aware of taking, just the room and the woman in it. and the particular arrangement of objects that told a story Claire's mind was working extremely fast to not understand. Then Vanessa looked at her in the mirror, set down her lipstick, turned around with the composure of a woman who had apparently considered the possibility of this moment and prepared for it. "You must be Claire," she said. "Bradley talks about you." She said it with a small smile, not cruel, almost conversational, as if she were meeting someone at a party who she had already heard pleasant things about. Claire looked at her for a moment, then she set the restaurant bag on the dresser, carefully, because her hands were shaking and she did not want to drop it. She turned around. She walked back down the corridor. She rode the elevator down to the parking garage. She got in her car, closed the door, put both hands on the steering wheel, and sat absolutely still for 45 minutes. She did not cry. She would cry later, enormously and privately, in the bathroom of her apartment in Charleston, with the shower running so she could not hear herself. But in the parking garage, she did not cry. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and felt the particular sensation of a version of the future dissolving, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a photograph fades if you leave it in the wrong light. Then she picked up her phone and called Donna. The response was immediate, comprehensive, and unprintable in its most vivid passages. It lasted approximately 6 minutes. At various points during those 6 minutes, Donna said things that Claire would remember for years and find useful in the way that furious, clear-eyed loyalty is always useful when you are not yet certain of your own anger. When Donna had finished, she said, "What do you need from me right now?" Claire thought about it. "Margaret Callahan's number," she said, the attorney. "You work with her sometimes." Donna was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I will text it to you right now." "Thank you," Claire said. "Are you okay to drive?" "I will be in 10 minutes," Claire said. "I just need 10 minutes." She sat in the parking garage for 8 more minutes. Then she started the car and drove home. She called Margaret Callahan the following morning, before she called her mother, before she called Bradley, before she told anyone else what had happened. Margaret answered on the second ring with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had heard every version of every story and still gave each one her full attention. Claire described the situation in precise language, without excessive emotion, the way her father had taught her to describe problems that needed solving. Margaret Callahan listened. Then she said, "All right, first thing, do not move any assets, do not delete any communications, and do not discuss the specifics with anyone except me until we understand the complete picture. Can you do that?" "Yes," Claire said. "Good," Margaret said. "Come in tomorrow morning at 9. Claire hung up. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee. Outside, the Charleston morning was cold and bright, the kind of clear November day that looks like something from a painting. She thought about what Vanessa had said. "You must be Claire. Bradley talks about you." She thought about the smile on Vanessa's face, the absolute, unhurried composure of it, the sense of a woman who is not afraid of the person in the doorway. She thought about the wine glasses, 2 of them, one half empty, an evening already in progress. She thought about the dinner she had made and carried 2 hours in a car and set on a dresser and left there. And for just a moment, one specific moment, the absurdity of it was almost funny. Almost. She picked up her phone and texted Jake. "Opening the studio late tomorrow. Can you cover the 9 o'clock drop-off?" Jake replied within 30 seconds. "On it. Everything okay?" "Fine," she wrote back. "Just a meeting." She closed her phone. She finished her coffee. Then she went to bed because she was going to need to be clear-headed in the morning, and falling apart tonight would not help anyone, least of all herself. Margaret Callahan's office was on the fifth floor of a building on Broad Street that had been a law office of one kind or another since before the Civil War. The furniture was old and solid. The bookshelves were full of actual books. On the credenza, behind her desk, sat 4 framed photographs of 4 dogs of varying sizes and a small trophy from a regional bar association that had been turned slightly sideways, whether by accident or philosophy, it was difficult to say. Margaret herself was 61, with silver hair, cut short and practical, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and lifted to her face with the deliberate economy of a woman who did not perform any action unnecessarily. She had been practicing family law for 30 years. She had seen everything. She was not easy to rattle. She listened to Claire for 20 minutes without interruption. She asked 4 questions. She took notes in a small leather notebook in handwriting that was extremely small and completely legible. Then she said, "Here is what we are going to do." The plan was methodical, documented, and designed to protect Claire's primary assets, the studio property, which had been purchased with a combination of her inheritance from her father and a loan in her name alone, and her professional reputation, which was worth considerably more than any single asset on paper. Bradley, when confronted, did not fight. This surprised Claire less than she expected. He was, in the end, a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for someone to make it official. He was sorry, he said. He had made mistakes. He had not intended for things to develop the way they had. Claire listened to all of this from across the living room of their apartment, standing near the window with her coffee cup in her hand, and thought about how the word mistakes was doing a great deal of work in those sentences. She did not say this out loud. She said, "My attorney will be in contact with yours." He looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be waiting for something more. For the crying, perhaps, or the questions or the scenes that people in this situation were supposed to perform for one another. Claire looked back at him and thought about the parking garage in Atlanta and the 45 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel and the 10 minutes she had asked herself for and used wisely. And she thought, "I already did that part. I did it alone. I do not owe you a viewing." She nodded once, went to the kitchen, washed her coffee cup. The separation agreement took 3 weeks to draft and 2 days to sign. Claire retained the studio building. She retained her apartment. She retained her name, her professional accounts, and her equipment. Bradley retained the Atlanta condo, his firm, and the particular consequences of his own decisions, which would, in due time, become considerably more complicated than he currently anticipated. Donna threw a dinner. It was homemade lasagna, because Donna believed that any significant life event required homemade lasagna, and she was not wrong. There was good wine, the kind that costs more than $10, which Donna considered a special occasion commitment. There was, eventually, crying of the ugly and companionable variety. There was a playlist titled Not His Anymore that featured, among other things, every Dolly Parton song Donna could identify from memory and at least 3 songs that had nothing to do with the situation but were on the playlist because Donna liked them. Jake, informed of the situation the following Monday, in careful and limited terms, responded by arriving at work the next day with a small potted succulent he set on Claire's work table and said was, quote, "low maintenance and extremely difficult to kill, like you." Claire laughed. For the first time in 2 weeks, she set the succulent on the windowsill. She named it something she kept to herself. She went back to work. For 11 days, things were quiet and manageable. She worked, she slept, she had dinner with Donna twice, and called her mother on Sunday at 10 and felt, cautiously, that the worst was behind her. She was, at this point, not entirely wrong. She was just approximately 72 hours early. The phone call from the Charleston Museum of Art came on a Thursday morning at 8:45. Claire was standing at the work table when she answered it, and she was still standing at the work table when it ended, but the room had changed quality entirely between those two moments. The museum was, regretfully, suspending their contract with Whitfield Restoration pending review of concerns that had been raised regarding the authenticity of the provenance documentation on a piece recently attributed to her studio. Claire set down her phone. She stood very still. She had never, not once, in 7 years of professional practice, misrepresented provenance or process. Her documentation was meticulous. Her methods were conservative and classically trained. She had staked her reputation on transparency so completely that even the language of the concern, raised, pending review, attributed, sounded like a sentence in a foreign language when applied to her name. The second call came from her landlord. An anonymous complaint had been filed regarding the commercial operation of her business in a space whose zoning classification was, apparently, being questioned. The third arrived as an email. A collector named Mr. Raymond, who had been weeks away from commissioning a significant restoration project worth $15,000, regretted to inform her that he would be working with another studio at this time. Claire sat down in her work chair. She called Donna. Donna, who had been a paralegal for 8 years and understood the mechanics of how damage was done to professional reputations without leaving fingerprints, listened to all 3 events in sequence and went very quiet. "How quiet?" Claire asked. "The kind of quiet," Donna said, "where I'm doing calculations." "What kind of calculations?" "The kind," Donna said, "that involve asking who in Charleston's commercial real estate network has the right connections to make 3 unrelated calls to 3 unrelated people and turn them into 3 unrelated problems for one specific person." Claire said nothing for a moment. "Vanessa Colton," she said. It was not really a question. "I'm going to find out," Donna said. "Give me 48 hours." She gave her 24. What Donna found, through her network of professional contacts and one paralegal colleague who knew everyone in the commercial real estate sector and was willing to share what she knew over lunch, was this. Vanessa Colton had made 3 carefully placed phone calls in the week following Claire's filing for separation. Not threats, not direct attacks, just questions asked to the right people in the right tone. A word of concern here, a mention of a hearing she had seen somewhere there, a comment about documentation practices, seeds planted with precision. Claire took this information to Margaret Callahan. Margaret Callahan opened her leather notebook and picked up her pen and said, "Good. Now I have something to work with." What saved Claire Whitfield was a habit her father had installed in her at age 16. During a summer, when he had her help him organize the documentation for his private collection. "Every piece of paper," he had said, "is a witness. Keep your witnesses." Claire had kept every witness. 7 years of client communications, restoration logs, photographic records, before and during and after every project. Provenance documentation, cross-referenced with independent sources, invoices, receipts, materials manifests. She kept it in both physical files organized by year and client, and in a digital archive that she backed up every Friday afternoon without exception. Jake, upon being told, in carefully limited terms, that they needed to locate every document connected to the museum contract, looked at the filing system for approximately 4 seconds and said, "I can have everything organized by project by end of business tomorrow." "Today?" Claire said. "By 4, he said. It was ready by 3:15. Margaret Callahan filed the defamation documentation the following morning, supported by a structured evidence package that demonstrated, clearly and in sequence, the relationship between Vanessa Colton's professional network, the timing of the 3 incidents, and the absence of any factual basis for any of the concerns raised. The museum review was completed in 10 days. Dr. Richard Alderman, the museum's chief curator, called Claire personally. He was a man in his late 50s who had been working in conservation for 30 years and understood professional integrity the way experienced practitioners understand things, not as an abstract principle, but as the concrete evidence of daily decisions. He told her that the documentation she had provided was among the most thorough he had seen in a review process, that the concerns raised against her had no evidentiary support, and that the museum was reinstating their contract effective immediately. He also told her that the person who had raised the initial concern, who had called a board member as a, quote, personal favor, had been identified, and that the museum did not appreciate the misuse of those relationships. Claire thanked him. She hung up. She sat in her studio in the November afternoon light and breathed for a long moment. The zoning complaint was dismissed within the week by a city inspector who found no basis for the claim and noted in his report that the business had been operating legally in the same location for 7 years without incident. Mr. Raymond emailed 3 days after the dismissal. He had, apparently, heard about the reinstatement. He was, he wrote, relieved that the concerns had proven unfounded, and he hoped, if she was still available, that they might discuss the commission. Claire read his email twice. Then she wrote back, "The commission is available. Please note that my rate has increased by 20% since our last conversation. Let me know if you would like to proceed on that basis." She sent it. She went back to work. He replied within an hour. He would like to proceed. Donna, who happened to be in the studio having lunch when the reply arrived, read the email over Claire's shoulder and produced a sound that Jake, in the back room, described later as somewhere between a cheer and a battle cry. "That," Donna said, pointing at the screen, "is the correct response to everything." Claire saved the email to the folder she labeled simply Keep. Margaret Callahan, when informed, said, "Good. Now let me tell you about the amended claim Bradley's attorney filed this morning." The call came on a Friday. Claire was locking up the studio for the weekend. She sat down on the front step, in her coat, her keys in her hand, and listened while Margaret explained that Bradley's attorney, a man named Clifford Reeves, described by Margaret in the tone people use for formidable opponents rather than contemptible ones, had filed an amended claim arguing that the studio property qualified as marital property. The argument rested on the fact that a joint account had contributed to the studio purchase during the marriage. The contribution had been minor, the joint account had been minor, and the primary funding had been Claire's inheritance clearly documented as premarital. But the law was not always about what was obvious, and Clifford Reeves had not built a successful practice by filing claims he expected to lose. If the claim succeeded, Claire could lose the building. She sat on the front step for a long moment after the call. The building that had been her father's name on the door before, it was hers. The radiator named Gerald. The windows that leaked in January. The floors that were never quite level. The studio where she had spent 7 years doing the only work she had ever wanted to do. She thought about Bradley in Atlanta, in the office where he had let her painting sit in direct sunlight for 6 weeks. The man who had told her the most interesting person he had ever met was her, right up until the point where he decided she was a liability. She stood up. She locked the door. She walked home. She called Margaret back at 8 in the morning on Saturday. "What do we do?" she said. Margaret was quiet for just a moment. Then, "We document everything: the inheritance, the account records, the timeline of the purchase. We build it piece by piece, and we make his argument impossible." "How long?" "If we're thorough, 6 weeks," Margaret said. "We're going to be thorough." They were thorough. Spring arrived in Charleston the way it always did, not gradually but suddenly, one Tuesday in March, when Claire walked out of the studio in the morning, and the air smelled different, and the light had changed, and the city seemed to have decided, overnight, to be beautiful again. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her coffee in her hand, her coat open, because it was finally warm enough. 6 months had passed since Atlanta. 3 months since the amended claim had been filed and was, according to Margaret, proceeding in exactly the direction they had prepared for. 2 months since Mr. Raymond's commission had been completed to his significant satisfaction, and he had referred 2 of his collectors to her. The studio had work booked 2 months ahead. Jake had learned to make coffee that was, in Claire's diplomatic assessment, within the acceptable range of the beverage it was attempting to be. He had also, in the past 6 months, developed into a genuinely skilled assistant whose eye for varnish condition was better than most people twice his experience. She had started teaching him the documentation process. He took to it with the earnest intensity he took to everything. The National Art Conservation publication, Fine and Restored, had contacted her about a feature on her studio's approach to documentation-first restoration. The article ran in their March issue with 2 photographs of her work table and a quote from Dr. Alderman at the museum that she read 3 times before she believed it was real. The calls that followed our article included a private collector named Mr. Hastings from Boston who had a significant estate project. 47 pieces of varying condition from a collection assembled over 50 years that would require a long-term engagement. She had her first phone call with Mr. Hastings on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. By the end of the call, the engagement was confirmed. It was the largest project of her career. She called Donna, who said, I told you from day one that the only thing that was ever wrong was that you were standing next to the wrong person." Claire laughed. "You told me he ironed his pants." "I told you he ironed his pants and that it could go either way," Donna said. "I have receipts." She did not, in fact, have receipts, but she was not wrong. That evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the Hastings project documents spread in front of her, Claire felt something she had been cautious about feeling for 6 months. She felt, genuinely and without qualifications, good. The legal process was ongoing. Bradley was still, through attorneys, being methodical about the property claim. The personal distance from everything was not yet complete, but she was through the worst of it, she was certain. The sabotage had been defeated. The museum was whole. The studio was thriving. The legal documentation was strong and getting stronger every week. She was almost through to the other side. The narrator, if there were one, would say here, she was right. She was just early. 3 weeks later, Bradley's attorneys produced, during the discovery process, financial records that nobody in the room was expecting. Margaret called Claire at 6 in the evening on a Thursday, which was not Margaret's style. Margaret called during business hours. She did not call at 6 on Thursdays. Claire picked up on the first ring. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning," Margaret said. Her voice was its usual measured professional tone, but there was something underneath it that Claire had not heard before. Not alarm, not distress, something more like the controlled care of a person who is about to put a heavy thing down in front of you and wants to make sure you're ready. "What happened?" Claire said. "There is a discovery," Margaret said, "that we need to discuss in person." Claire came in at 8:30. She sat across from Margaret in the solid office with the photographs of the 4 dogs and the sideways trophy, and she listened while Margaret described what the forensic accountant, a quiet, unhurried man named Howard Fleming, who had been untangling financial records for 22 years, had found. Bradley had moved significant joint funds into a private account. Not after the separation, not after Atlanta, 14 months before. While Claire was attending his client dinners and memorizing names and trying new dresses and telling herself that marriage had its seasons and this one was demanding, her husband had already been building an exit. Claire sat with this for a long moment. She looked at the paper Margaret slid across the desk, the dates, the amounts, the account number that had no connection to anything they had reviewed before. She said very quietly, "He was never working on the marriage." "It appears," Margaret said carefully, "that he had made a decision before you were aware there was a decision to be made." Claire looked at the window. The Charleston morning was clear and ordinary outside. People walking, a bus, the usual sounds of a city continuing its business. She thought about Vanessa Colton in the hotel room mirror. The composure, the smile, the sense of a woman who was not afraid of the person in the doorway. She thought about it differently now. "Does this help our case?" she said. "It helps our case," Margaret said. "Considerably." "Then let's continue," Claire said, and reached for her pen. The legal momentum was building in Claire's direction, and she knew it. And she was, cautiously, beginning to allow herself to feel something approaching confidence, which is precisely the moment when the next 3 things happened. They happened in sequence, within 11 days of each other, with the mechanical efficiency of events that have been set in motion by causes you have not yet fully understood. The first was the legal ambush. Clifford Reeves, Bradley's attorney, filed a motion that Margaret described as aggressive in a tone that made the word sound like a technical assessment rather than an adjective. The motion argued that new financial review had revealed additional marital property claims, claims that reached further into the studio's assets than the original property claim had suggested. It was not a strong argument, but it was a well-constructed one, and it would require response, documentation, and hearing time. It would cost Claire money she had not budgeted for, and it would cost her time she had been planning to spend on the Hastings project. She called Margaret from the studio that evening. Margaret told her what they needed. Claire said, "All right, what do you need from me?" "Everything you have from the studio accounts going back to the original purchase," Margaret said. "I'll have it to you Monday," Claire said. She worked through the weekend organizing the records. Jake came in on Saturday morning without being asked, spent 6 hours pulling files, and left at 4 in the afternoon, having accomplished more than Claire had hoped for. He said nothing about why he had come in on his day off. She said nothing about it either. She put a small bonus in his next paycheck and left it at that. The second catastrophe arrived from an unexpected direction. The forensic review, which had been proceeding through the standard discovery process, surfaced a second name on one of the private accounts Bradley had opened 14 months before the separation. The name was Vanessa Colton. Howard Fleming presented this finding with the calm of a man for whom surprises were an occupational regularity. What the account history suggested, traced through a series of shell LLC structures and a prior business relationship between Bradley and Vanessa that predated her introduction to Bradley by 2 years, was this. The relationship between Bradley and Vanessa had not begun as a romance that became a conspiracy. It had begun as a business arrangement that had been dressed, for strategic purposes, as a romance. Vanessa Colton had not fallen for a married man. She had helped design the exit of the married man from his marriage, the soulful lunches, the compliments, the carefully calibrated admiration These were not the organic expression of a developing attraction. They were the cover story, the studio sabotage, the professional attacks. These were not the jealousy of a woman protecting her new relationship. They were the work of a business partner protecting an investment. Margaret relayed this to Claire with careful language and precise sequencing, watching Claire's face across the desk with the attention of a woman who had delivered hard information to people for 30 years. Claire sat with it. She thought about Vanessa at the hotel mirror, applying lipstick with absolute composure, turning around saying, "You must be Claire. Bradley talks about you." She thought about that smile. She said, "She knew exactly who I was when she walked into that room." "It appears so," Margaret said. "She wasn't surprised to see me," Claire said. "She was ready for me." "That is a reasonable reading of the evidence," Margaret said. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Does this change the civil case?" "It expands it considerably," Margaret said. "Good," Claire said. "I want it to be complete." The third catastrophe was the most public, and in some ways, the least structurally significant. But it was the one that pressed hardest on the part of Claire. That was still, despite everything, a person, and not simply a party to a legal proceeding. Vanessa posted the photograph on a Saturday evening. It was from a charity gala, a glossy, chandelier-lit event in Atlanta that Claire could see in the background details of the image was genuinely beautiful. Bradley was in a navy suit, looking polished and comfortable. Vanessa was in silver, standing close to him, looking precisely like a woman who had arranged for the photograph to be taken at that exact angle. The caption read, "Building a life that fits." Someone from Claire's professional network, a woman named Sandra who was genuinely kind and had terrible judgment about what was helpful, tagged Claire in the comments with a laughing emoji and the words, "Look at this. Can you believe it?" By Sunday morning, the tag had been seen by enough people in Charleston's overlapping social and professional networks that Claire's phone contained 17 messages from people she had varying degrees of relationship with, ranging from warm sympathy to the kind of curiosity that dresses itself as concern. Jake, who checked the studio email on Sunday mornings, intercepted the professional messages that had filtered through to the business account. He responded to each one with a brief, composed note that said, "Claire is doing well, and the studio is fully operational. Thank you for your concern." He did this for 12 messages before Claire called him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at the photograph. She made herself look at it properly, not quickly, not turning away. She thought about the word fits, building a life that fits. She thought about trying on new dresses and practicing makeup in a mirror and memorizing names at dinners where nobody addressed her directly. She thought about what fitting had cost her and what it had produced and what she had actually been building during all of it. She opened her laptop. She found the invitation to the Hargrove Foundation Charity Gala that had arrived 8 weeks ago and sat in her inbox unanswered. The event honored conservation and preservation professionals across the Southeast. She had been invited based on her museum work and the fine and restored article. She had declined politely, saying she was unavailable. She clicked on the email. She replied, "I would be glad to attend. Please confirm my registration." She closed the laptop. She called Donna. "I need a dress," she said. "Finally," said Donna. Patricia Ellsworth had been dressing women in Charleston for 31 years from a boutique on King Street that had no sign outside except the street number and a small brass plate that said, simply, "Ellsworth, you knew about it because someone told you and someone told them," and the chain of telling went back 31 years to Patricia's first client. who had come in the week of her divorce and left with a dress that made her feel, for the first time in 2 years, like the truest version of herself. Patricia was 63, with white hair and the precise movements of someone who did not waste energy on unnecessary actions. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was worth attention. Claire told her, simply, something that says, I am not hiding and I am not trying. I'm just here. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned to the back of the rack without ceremony and pulled out a gown in deep crimson. Simple cut. No embellishment. The kind of dress that required nothing from the person wearing it except presence. This one, Patricia said. Claire stood in the mirror. She looked at herself for a long time. She was not transformed. She had not become someone different. She was, in the mirror, simply herself with the volume turned up. All the parts that were always there, now given room to show. That was the difference. Not performance, not effort. Room. Yes, well, she said. Donna arrived at Claire's apartment at 4 on the afternoon of the gala. She did Claire's hair in a way that was simple and exact and took 45 minutes. During those 45 minutes, Donna talked about something else entirely. About a case she was working on, about a television show she had started, about a restaurant she thought they should try next week. She talked the way someone talks when they are deliberately filling a space so that the person sitting in the chair does not have to think too hard about what they are doing and why. This was one of the many ways in which Donna Pierce was a person worth keeping. When she finished, she stepped back and looked. Okay, she said. She cleared her throat. Okay, you look. Don't cry, Claire said. I'm not crying, Donna said. You are going to cry. I am not. She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. You look like your father would be very proud. Claire looked in the mirror again. Yeah, she said softly. I think so. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Belmont Hotel, a restored historic building downtown that Claire had, as it happened, been asked to consult on 2 years ago regarding the condition of several landscape paintings that lined the main corridor. She had spent 3 afternoons in this building. She knew its bones. Bradley and Vanessa arrived at 6:15. Vanessa had selected the silver dress with the kind of deliberate precision that made clear she was not unaware of how she looked in silver. She moved through the early arrivals easily, remembering names, asking the right questions, placing herself in conversations with the efficiency of someone who understood the room as territory to be navigated. Bradley followed her lead. He greeted people she introduced him to. He accepted the credit she offered him in conversation. He was, in that particular room, with that particular woman, performing the version of himself she had helped construct. Polished, connected, arrived. Claire walked in at 7:20. She did not pause at the entrance. She did not survey the room. She simply walked in, moving through the space. The way someone moves when they know exactly where they are going, because she did. She was heading toward the curator's position near the East Wing, where Dr. Alderman had told her in his confirmation email he would be standing. The current in the room shifted. It was subtle. The kind of thing that people noticed without quite realizing they had noticed it. A pause in a conversation. A head turned. The slight gravitational adjustment of a room becoming aware of a presence it had not accounted for. Dr. Alderman found her immediately and brought her directly into a conversation with 3 foundation donors, one of whom had a private collection Claire had heard of through professional circles. She began talking about her work, naturally, specifically, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 7 years doing the thing rather than 6 years talking about doing it. The people in the conversation leaned in. From across the room, Bradley saw her. He watched three people whose meetings he had been trying to secure for 6 months move toward her with the body language of people who had just found the most interesting conversation available. He did not move. He stood with his champagne glass and watched. Vanessa, beside him, noticed his stillness. She looked across the room. She saw the crimson dress. She saw the circle forming around Claire. She saw the quiet, undeniable way the room had redistributed its attention. She kept her expression precisely controlled. But the glass in her hand was gripped slightly tighter than it had been a moment before. The donor with the private collection asked Claire for a card. Then the woman beside him asked for one. Dr. Alderman, watching this, turned to the third donor, a man who funded the Foundation's major conservation grants, and said quietly, "This is the studio I mentioned." Claire gave out 4 business cards over the course of the next hour. She received 2 invitations to visit private collections. She had a 20-minute conversation with the grant director that ended with him asking her to submit a proposal. Near the end of the evening, Bradley approached her. He came from her left, slowly, in the particular way of someone who has spent time deciding whether to do this and is not quite finished deciding by the time they arrive. "Claire," he said. She turned. Her expression was composed and unhurried and entirely without performance. "You look—" He paused. "I know," she said, simply, without edge. He tried again. "I handled things." "Bradley," she looked at him evenly. "You were strategic about the finances and careless about the person, and you were surprised when the person was more durable than the strategy. I don't need your apology. We need a clean settlement. Margaret is working on it." She smiled. It was a real smile. Not warm, not cold. Just done. Then she turned and walked back toward Dr. Alderman, who was waiting to introduce her to someone. Bradley stood alone for a moment. Vanessa appeared at his elbow. Neither of them spoke. In the silence between them, something had shifted. Some precise weight that had kept the arrangement balanced, now gone, leaving 2 people standing in a beautiful room with nothing to say to each other that would actually help. 3 weeks after the gala, Howard Fleming submitted his complete findings to Margaret Callahan. The document was 42 pages. Margaret called Claire at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday and said, "Come in when you can. The news is significant." She came in at 9. The picture that the forensic accounting had constructed, piece by piece and transfer by transfer, was this. 14 months before the separation, Bradley had begun moving assets in coordination with a development scheme run through a series of shell LLCs, 2 of which bore Vanessa Colton's signature on the incorporation documents. The scheme involved properties in 3 counties, purchased using funds that included sheltered marital assets. In other words, the money that should have been part of the marital estate had, through a carefully structured series of transactions, been moved into a business arrangement in which the wife was not a party, and the girlfriend was not only a party, but an architect. The property deal they were building together was, Margaret explained with measured words, not entirely legal in its structure. The specific issue involved the source documentation on 2 of the property transfers, which bore characteristics that were, in Howard Fleming's language, inconsistent with legitimate origination. This was a civil matter. It would become, eventually, a matter for other parties. But first, it was a matter for Claire's settlement. "What does this mean for us?" Claire said. "It means," Margaret said, "that the hidden assets are now fully documented, the shell structures are mapped, and the court is going to look at this case very differently than it has been. It also means that Clifford Reeves is going to have a very difficult conversation with his client this week." She was right. Clifford Reeves withdrew the amended property claim within 10 days. The strategic aggression of the filing, which had looked like strength from a distance, turned out to have been designed to distract from, rather than supplement, Bradley's actual position. Without the distraction, the position was considerably weaker than it had been presented. The settlement negotiation that followed took 8 weeks. It was methodical, and Margaret was relentless, and Claire did what Margaret told her to do and kept her head and showed up to every meeting with the documentation organized exactly as requested. In the end, Claire retained the studio building outright, received a financial settlement that reflected the full extent of the hidden assets, and closed the marriage with a legal finality that left nothing conditional or contested. She signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon in Margaret's office. She set down the pen. She looked at the signature for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Margaret." Margaret, who did not typically engage in sentimentality during professional hours, looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You made my job easy. You kept every record. Most people don't." "My father taught me to," Claire said. Margaret nodded. He was right. Claire walked out of the building onto Broad Street. The afternoon was warm and clear. Late September, the trees just beginning to change. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and did something she had not done in almost a year. She stood still without thinking about what needed to happen next. She just stood there, in the afternoon, in her city, on her own. Donna, who had been waiting across the street with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, crossed over and handed one to her without ceremony. "Well," she said. "It's done," Claire said. Donna handed her the coffee. They stood on the sidewalk and drank it, and looked at nothing in particular. And the afternoon went on, around them, the way afternoons do. "What do you want for dinner?" Donna said eventually. "The pasta thing," Claire said. "I knew it," Donna said. 3 days later, the story's final chapter arrived in a form Claire had not anticipated. A detective named Walter Briggs from the Financial Crimes Division called Margaret Callahan regarding the LLC structures and property transfer documentation that had surfaced during the discovery process. He had been tracking a related complaint from one of the county property offices for several months. The forensic findings from the settlement case were, he said, extremely useful. Margaret informed Claire of the call. Claire cooperated fully, providing a copy of the complete forensic report through proper channels. She did not follow the investigation closely after that. It was not, in the end, her case to manage. But she heard, through Margaret, 3 months later, that Vanessa Colton had been interviewed by investigators and had retained criminal defense counsel. She heard, through Donna, who heard it from her colleague, who knew everyone in commercial real estate, that Bradley Harmon's firm had quietly separated from him, citing the reputational risk. She did not feel triumph at this. She had been afraid she would, afraid that the news would come in and she would feel something sharp and satisfying, the way revenge is supposed to feel, and that the feeling would mean something about who she was. But what she actually felt was much simpler than that. She felt like someone who had been carrying a heavy thing had put it down, not dropped it, not thrown it, just set it down, carefully, where it could stay. October came back around, 1 full year since the bell above the studio door had rung, and a man in a tailored suit had walked in carrying a painting and said, "Money is not the issue." Claire was standing at her work table on a Thursday morning when she thought about that sentence, about how it was true in ways he had not intended, and false in ways he had not understood, and how she had walked through the entire year between that sentence and this one and arrived somewhere she had not expected and could not have planned. The studio was expanded now. She had taken over the adjacent space in June, breaking through a wall that had separated 2 rooms that should have been 1. The new layout gave her a proper drying room, a second workstation, and a storage area that no longer required Jake to practice yoga-like contortions to reach the back shelf, which he had been doing without complaint for 18 months. The 2 new apprentices, Lily Crawford and Tom Ashworth, both recent graduates, both genuinely talented, in ways that made Claire feel the specific satisfaction of watching something good begin, occupied the second workstation 3 days a week, and learned, as she had learned, that the most important thing was patience, that the work revealed itself in layers, and that hurrying the layers was how you destroyed what you were trying to save. Jake had learned to make coffee. This was not a small thing. It had taken 19 months and 3 different coffee machines and 1 extended period in which the studio operated on coffee purchased from the place on the corner, which was perfectly good coffee and only $3, but which Jake experienced as a personal failure he was determined to correct. He had corrected it. The coffee was now reliably good. He had also become, over the same 19 months, the kind of professional that clients specifically mentioned when they referred the studio to other collectors. His documentation was precise. His eye was developing. He had opinions about varnish that were increasingly worth having. Claire had given him a title, Assistant Conservator. He had looked at the new business card for a long time. Then he put it carefully in his wallet and went back to work. The Hastings project had been completed in April after 6 months of work that involved 47 pieces, considerable travel, and 1 specific oil painting from the mid-18th century that Claire had spent 3 weeks on, alone and considered, quietly, among the finest restoration work she had done in her professional life. Mr. Hastings had come to Charleston to see the completed collection before it was returned to his estate. He had walked through the pieces slowly, one by one, and at the end, he had turned to Claire and said, "You give things back what they were." She had thought about that on the drive home, about whether that was the right way to describe it, about what it meant to give something back what it was versus what it meant to restore what had been there before you arrived. She was still thinking about it in pleasant and productive ways. The grant proposal she had submitted to the Hargrove Foundation in October of the previous year had been approved in March. The grant funded a documentation methodology project, a research initiative she had been sketching the outline of for 2 years, examining best practices for provenance, documentation, and privately owned collections across the Southeast. It was, in her estimation, necessary work. It would take 3 years. She had started in April. She wrote about it sometimes, on the evenings when the studio was closed and the apartment was quiet, and she was not tired in the way that required sleep, but in the way that required thinking through things in language. The writing was for herself, not for publication. Though Margaret had read 1 passage over dinner in July and said, matter-of-factly, that she should consider publishing. Maybe eventually, Claire said. Sooner, Margaret said. And that was the whole of the conversation. On a Tuesday in late October, 1 year exactly from the morning she had examined a damaged landscape for a man who filled rooms by expecting to, Claire locked the studio at 5:30 and walked home along the waterfront. The evening light was doing its October thing, going gold and long across the harbor, the water darker than summer. She walked slowly, her coat open, her hands in her pockets. She passed the hotel where she had once spent 45 minutes with her hands on a steering wheel. She passed it without stopping, without slowing, without the particular internal bracing she had, for a while, needed to walk past it. It was a building. It had a parking garage and an 8th floor and a service entrance and a lobby with a fountain. That was all it was now. She walked the rest of the way home, thinking about the Hastings estate's daughter, who had called that afternoon to ask if Claire would consider taking on a second collection, her grandmother's, smaller, several pieces in concerning condition. She was thinking about how to structure the preliminary assessment. She was thinking about what the documentation approach would require. She was not thinking about Bradley Harmon or Vanessa Colton or the year that had accumulated between then and now. Not because she was suppressing anything, just because there was genuinely more interesting material to think about. Her phone rang as she turned onto her street. Donna. "Dinner tomorrow?" Donna said, without preamble. "Yes," Claire said. "What are we making?" "I was thinking that lemon chicken thing." "I'll bring wine." "Bring good wine," Donna said. "We're celebrating." Claire smiled. She had stopped asking what they were celebrating. Donna was always celebrating something. A case won, a Tuesday that had gone better than expected, the simple, ongoing fact of things being all right. "We're celebrating," Donna repeated, "that you have a grant, a full studio, 2 apprentices, and a coffee maker that works, and you did all of that in 1 year." "Jake fixed the coffee maker," Claire said. "We're celebrating Jake too," Donna said. "He deserves it. He answers emails on Sundays." "He really does," Claire said. She unlocked her apartment door. The evening light came through the living room windows at the long October angle she had always liked. On the shelf above the fireplace, where she had put the photograph of her father in his Navy uniform years ago, the photograph was still there. She set down her bag. She looked at it for a moment. Some things survived wars. She went to the kitchen to start dinner. The studio was full. The work was real. The records were kept. The building was hers. She was, in every way that mattered, restored. Not because anyone had given anything back to her, not because she had recovered something lost, but because she had kept going, piece by piece and layer by layer, doing the work in front of her, keeping her witnesses, trusting the patience her father had taught her, and arriving, finally, without drama, without fanfare, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in October, at a life she had built herself. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything. Final closing statement. The story you just heard was researched, constructed, and edited entirely by hand. Written word by word with intention, shaped with care, and built to carry meaning rather than simply fill time. No shortcuts, no automation. Every detail was chosen deliberately to give you something real to take with you. We believe the stories worth telling are the ones worth telling properly. Thank you for listening to the end. That means more than you know.